We walked with the group of men and the elven soldier to the execution that was underway. Where it was to take place, I did not know. My heart paced irregularly. I kept my attention towards the ground, thinking of my other siblings who could very well be the reason for this gathering. My deep thought was interrupted by a sudden stumbling of feet I undertook. Father thanking him, I was caught by Aerith before I could fall. One of the men in our group nudged me on the shoulder. "Too much to drink, lad?" he asked with a stupid grin across his face. "Not enough, I'm afraid," I responded. "Oh, I hear that, lad." I studied the man, for he was odd to say the least. His tunic and trousers, although simple in design, were covered with vines, thick ones that wrapped around his chest and ribs. Large leaves stemmed down from the vines, those covered his stomach. His buckle was made from a thinner assortment of vines that kept his trousers up. His shoes seemed to be simple cords of vines intertwined. They were wrapped around his feet. His toes were the only exposed part, but those were covered in a dark soot. He wore gloves that had the same vine cord design as his shoes, though his fingers were not covered in soot. I looked the man in the eyes with a questioning glare. "What? Never seen Gians wear?" "Gian? Whom do you speak of?" I questioned. "Oh, well, they are nature-dwelling people. They're much taller than man and elves, much wider, almost as massive as the trees, though that's only some. They mainly reside in the southeast, in the Crane region. I grew up there in one of their sanctuaries, thus why I wear the clothing." "And what business do you have here that draws you so far from home?" "Oh, just passing through with my party. But the guards forced me to come to the execution. Best to not cause problems for them. Speaking of," he says, pointing forward. I turned to see a gate where elven guards stand vigilant off to the side. They were swung wide open for the great crowd of menfolk to enter. It appeared to be a courtyard in the distance, and past that, the Capitol Tower, which stood erect, glistening in the sun as its shadow shaded us. We were now in the Gilded District, a place where officials were to gather for important meetings. It was also for people to gather for announcements, decrees, and, currently, executions. As we were approaching the gate, I took notice of a woman who was begging the elven guard to let her into the courtyard. She wished to save her son from the execution. My worry for my brother's safety was relieved, but dread still remained as the woman pleaded helplessly to the guard. The gates opened for our group, and the mother leapt to her feet to try and get in. The guards held her back as we all shuffled in. She let out a pained scream as the gates closed on her. Some of the men muttered among themselves, making mention of how terrible this occasion was and how they didn't want to see someone's child die. "Her son can't be helped," Ian said to me, "but we can stop this from happening again with our efforts here. Remember that." I could only respond with a slight nod. Our group merged with another that resided in the courtyard. The murmurings grew into shouting as men tried to talk amongst themselves in the large gathering. My brothers and I looked for our other siblings to see if they were among the masses. I felt a tugging at my shirt and turned to an arm that extended from in between two men. The arm pulled on me and brought one of my brothers into view. It was Folty. He had managed to find us, and he dragged along Toldir with him. "Aha! I knew I had seen you!" Folty shouted. "Folty, I am glad, but where are Bolbir and Tavern?" "Behind," Tavern stated as he pushed through the crowd. Bolbir came up from behind him, abnormally nervous. "Do you know what this gathering is for? The elven gods refused to tell us," Folty asked. "An execution," Jörn said as the crowd was silenced by the sight of a large elf approaching the top of a stand that rested against the courtyard's wall. This elf was another elite, like the guards at the gate, though its armor signified a much higher rank, a rank that wasn't recognized by mark, but rather the color and design that had been painted over the bits of armor it wore. Red and black colors were drawn in spiral fashions till they intertwined at the center. The former emblem of Sunraiser, a red sun hanging over the Capitol Tower which was colored black, was painted on the shield he carried. 6 swords pierced the sun, those swords being white. The rest of his attire was black and red robes that flowed to its knees and hung at its ankle. The exception to this pattern were his hands and feet, which were powdered white. Its appearance, though discomforting to even the bravest of men, paled in the fright that its demeanor had given me. It wore a smirk that stretched ear to ear. Its teeth stained a dark red that had nearly matched the color scheme of its attire. They were clasped together, yet it didn't seem like the elf was biting down out of anxiety. In fact, it seemed to be delighted with the occasion. Once it reached the top of the stand, it turned to face the crowd. It looked left, then right, at the many worried faces of the people who were not prepared for what came next. It called out for the Westman ambassador, Saul, to approach, as well as the one to be executed. A young man, barely reaching adulthood, was dragged out by a hooded executioner. The boy was battered and beaten. The only features on his face one could make out were his blackened eyes, swollen lips, and his captor mark, which was in the shape of a horse. The young man was seated on a chair and had a noose put around his neck. The noose kept his head propped up, preventing it from slumping forward. Saul, the ambassador, walked on the stage next. The crowd of men we were in began to grumble amongst themselves as the ambassador approached. The ambassador was plump, short, and stubby. He wore purple robes which were stained with sweat marks, though he didn't seem to be in poor enough shape to sweat so profusely. His eyes had bags, the sides of his mouth sagged, and his ears drooped. He had a look of distress as well, which added more years onto his appearance than there may have been. The ambassador cleared his throat to speak.
My fellow men, we have gathered here at the elves' request. This is an execution of one who deserves it very much so. The man you see before you, Herrick Shant, has been conducting treasonous activities within the city. He has helped escort prisoners within our allies' holding out of Sunraiser, stolen from various stores valuable supplies for these prisoners to then use, and has murdered many protectors of our fine city in the process of saving the fugitives. It greatly pains me to bid this man farewell, for he was a gracious and courteous servant to all, before he had turned away from a good path, a path that many were never given the opportunity to partake in. It is within our best interest, for the sake of our community, that we be reminded of what happens to those that disobey the just laws of these lands. The coward turned towards Herrick. He cleared his throat once more. Herrick Shant, for your treasonous behavior, you will be hung. I give the elves my blessing. I am sorry for your family's loss. Herrick looked up at Saul. Despite his eyes being puffed up and his lips being swollen, he was still able to express such bitter sadness. He uttered something to Saul that I could not hear, before looking back down at the ground once more as best as he could. Several tears fell from his eyes, though no sobbing was made. The ambassador stood there for a moment, staring at the young man, then walked back to where he was standing. The man seemed deservingly more distressed. The crowd stood there in anticipation, their mumbling now turned into silence. They were now waiting for the moment to arrive. The elven elite walked in front of Herrick and drew his axe. He held it over the boy's head. I, Jackson Tield, deem you worthy of death by the noose. The executioner may now begin, it says before it withdraws its axe and walks away from Herrick. The executioner puts its hands over the handle of the lever which controlled the panel holding the chair Herrick sat upon. It pulls the lever, and Herrick falls. The bruised and beaten body of the boy descends. A snap is heard, and Herrick's body goes limp. I had to turn away, for a moment. I had to look at something else. My brothers' faces were the first thing I turned towards. Yrn had a sympathetical gaze and a tired expression. His heart went out to Herrick, but it must have grown weary from sending it out to so many others before him. Bulin shook with an unsatiable rage, his hand trembling as he wanted to clench his knife. I would not blame him for lashing out here, but he withheld his wrath from the ever-deserving foe. The rest of my brothers attempted to look away as I did, or trembled with rage as Bulin did, all except for Tavern. He seemed to be staring at the elven elite who ordained the execution, studying it, sizing the creature up in his mind. I had to turn away. His lack of woe was understandable after all his years of battle, but his infallible focus on the fight ahead still sickened me almost as much as the execution. I had hoped I would never go down his path. I faced my head back to the grisly sight. Two frail manslaves, both weeping, tears staining their tattered clothing, loosened the noose around the body and carried it through the courtyard. The crowd parted so that they may pass through. The onlookers kept fixed eyes on the three of them. As I gazed upon their faces, I had noticed they were not all tired, angered, or somber expressions. A few had faces of excitement, glee, as if this were a mere show to them, as if the stage meant for execution and punishment was a play put on for them.
Worse than these few were the ones who smirked like the damn elf. Faces exuding supremacy and authority, the elves had an influence on the townsmen and traders that I had not seen before. For some, the privilege of residing under their domain seems to have wiped clear the commonality they once shared with their fellow man, a fellow man that was enslaved before their very eyes. And as I gazed into these twisted men faces, trying to unravel the dark snare they wrapped themselves in, I heard amongst them, "Good riddance. No good comes from the likes of them. Why must the slaves cause trouble? Leave us be." A relief, this best not strain our alliance with the elves. I turned away. My gut sank as deep as the pit these men could never climb out of. They had abandoned the sanctity of mankind, something I had thought not possible in all of my fatherly given days. The elves, damn them, their comforts be cursed, and these men be chastised for their disobedience. I gazed up at the traitor named Saul, the leader of these jesters who rest in the court of a pestilence that troubles our father. He cleared his throat, droplets of sweat and saliva spilling from the sides of his fat mouth as he opened that disgusting orifice to speak. "You may commence business once more. Go about your way, not in anger or strife, but with a sense of justice, that the wrongs of this world have been dealt with swiftly, due thanks being given to our efforts." It stepped off the platform, along with the elf. The people went about their business, and our brother sank into the crowd once more. I had pulled Jörn to my side. He looked at me with intelligent eyes. "Jörn, Herrick, the young man, he looked to be Erif's age. To witness suffering harsh as that weakens one's restraint. It would be wise to rally their spirits, remind them of our goal," I told my brother. Jörn simply nods and looks forward as the crowd begins to part down into the various streetways, shuffling into houses or going further to the markets and places of business. The 8 of us kept silent and to ourselves as we looked for somewhere to discuss a plan. Our priestly guide seemed to still be trailing us. We had lost him in the conundrum prior, and I had half expected him to leave us. It was best to keep him at an arm's length, though still near us, if we can manage his attention in such a way. My brothers and I walked a short ways till we reached a building where a clay statue of a horse rested outside of it, a mug in between its hoof. Folty, who was in front of me, tapped Bielin's shoulder and pointed at it, probably finding humor in its absurdity. Bielin gave the statue a glance and let a huff of air release from his nose, though quickly fixed his head on the path ahead. Folty put his hands back in his pockets and looked down at the ground. As we approached the tavern, Erif opened a door, then propped it open with his foot, allowing us entry. We all stepped inside and sat at a bench, though the priest took a seat in the corner of the room, still muttering prayers to his interpretation of the Father. The tavern was empty, all except for the serving maiden. The owner must have been out, Father we think. The maiden approached us. She was young and lively. Despite her status as a slave, she seemed to be well kept, her hair being washed and her dress being a radiant yellow with bows resting on her shoulder sleeves. The dress was of a higher quality than what the elderly server, who served at the tavern we spent the night prior, had worn.
"Drinks for our friends here?"
"Yes, 8 angry wines, please," Jörn asked.
"Oh, wine? You men are quite peculiar,"
she says before walking off to a back room. All of us sat in silence for a moment, looking at each other, the table, or around the room. Folty muttered something under his breath, something about the drinks we were ordering. "Mind sharing your thoughts, brother?" Tavern spoke up. "I was merely stating to myself that wine was a peculiar choice. Figured a drink of comfort would be more fitting than a drink meant for clearing one's palate." "Inebriation would be foolish, especially now. You realize, Folty?" Jörn asked. "Foolish, but comforting. This city is cursed. I failed to see fault in his thinking, brother Jörn," Bielin spoke. Jörn nodded, his head in agreement, then looked at Tavern with his hands folded and pressed them against his mouth to keep his head propped up. Tavern then turned to Toldir, who pulled something from his sack. It was parchment, and the parchment contained a drawing of Sunraiser from a top-down view, a crude map of sorts. There were dots where lines both originated from and connected to, all of them starting from the walls of Sunraiser and leading towards the Capitol Tower. Sewers written in charcoal in the upper rightmost part of the parchment. Bolbir looks at me with a grin and nods his head as I looked at the parchment with a mouth agape. Folty nudges my shoulder.
"We procured it before arriving at the execution. Toldir snuck into a house, whom resided a master of the sewers. Bobby and I kept said master occupied with talk of the news in the north, of King Taurus and some. Faulty, you give credit where it is not meant. I merely affirmed what you were saying to the man. You were a great converser to bounce off of, though.
Wait, what was Tavern doing that whole time?
Watching us do the work, though he says it's testing,
Tolder said with a smirk smitten across his face.
You performed quite well, if that is what you wish to hear, Toldir,
Tavern said, looking over at him with a soft grin.
I do think that's what most of us wish to hear,
I had commented.
I agree. Where is my compliment? Stuck underneath all of the smog. I will let you know when I have coughed it out.
Jörn chuckled at his response, as did Bulin, and soon everyone followed suit, hearty and cheery laughing gracing the once silent tavern. The maiden appeared with our drinks at long last, and set them down in front of all of us.
Well, glad some can laugh. Father knows we need more of it in this place. Enjoy, friends,
the maiden said after placing the last drink in front of Arif, then disappearing into the back room once more. We all stared down at our drink as our laughter subsided. Jörn turned back towards the priest, who seemed to have fallen into a nap of sorts, then back to his drink. He grabbed the glass and rose it into the air, standing as he did so. The drink's red hue was brightened by this candlelight that rested above us on a steel mantle mounted to a column. As Jörn kept it raised, he looked to me. This drink is in honor of Herrick, the last man to die an unjust death in Sunraiser. He then turned his head to Tavern, who rose his glass next, then the rest of us followed suit, standing to do so. We then took a drink for Herrick, the last man to die unjustly in Sunraiser.